The last story is shocking. Number 1. The Cabin in the Pines. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, my best friend Jake, and the quiet solitude of the woods. We'd rented a small cabin deep in the pine forest, miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature. It sounded perfect. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The cabin was old, with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell that clung to the air. The windows were small, letting in only slivers of light, and the forest outside seemed to press in on all sides. Jake joked that it looked like the setting of a horror movie, but I could tell he was uneasy too. Still, we unpacked our gear and tried to make the best of it. The first night was uneventful. We grilled burgers, drank a few beers, and sat by the fire, telling stories and laughing. But as the fire died down and the woods grew darker, the atmosphere shifted. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, fell silent. It was as if something had scared everything into hiding. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching. At first I thought it was a branch against the window, but the noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I lay there, my heart pounding, listening as it moved around the cabin, first at the window, then the door, then the walls. I wanted to wake Jake, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, the scratching stopped, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I told Jake about the noise. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease, but the forest felt wrong. The trees were too close together, their branches twisted and gnarled, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. We didn't see a single animal the entire time. That night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jake heard it too, and we sat in the dark, staring at each other, too afraid to speak. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps on the door, followed by a voice. It sounded like a man, but the words were garbled, as if spoken through water. Jake grabbed a flashlight and a knife, and we crept to the door. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice trembling. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." It was Jake's voice. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Jake's face went pale, and he took a step back. The voice repeated the words over and over, each time sounding more desperate, more distorted. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. Then the door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Jake lunged forward and slammed the deadbolt shut, but the knocking grew louder, more frantic. The voice was screaming now, a cacophony of sounds that didn't belong together, human words mixed with animalistic growls. We backed away from the door, clutching each other, as the walls of the cabin seemed to close in around us. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. We waited, barely breathing, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed our things and fled, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind. We never spoke about what happened that weekend. Jake moved across the country a few months later, and we drifted apart. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice, his voice, whispering in the darkness, begging to be let in. And I know, no matter how far I run, it's still out there, waiting. Number 2, the thing in the field. Growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, I was used to the quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the wind rustling through the cornfields and the distant howl of a coyote under a starry sky. But there was one rule my parents drilled into me from the time I could walk. Never go into the fields at night. They never explained why, but the way they said it, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the windows, made it clear it wasn't up for discussion. Of course, as a teenager, I didn't listen, and that's how I ended up face to face with something I still can't explain. It was the summer I turned 16. My friends and I were bored out of our minds, as teenagers in a small town often are. We'd been sitting around a bonfire in my backyard, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. Someone, I think it was my friend Tyler, brought up the old rule about the fields. "Why can't you go out there at night?" he asked, smirking. "What's so scary about a bunch of corn?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "I don't know. My parents just say not to. Probably just superstition or something." Tyler leaned forward, his face lit by the flickering firelight. "Or maybe there's something out there. Something they don't want you to see." The others laughed, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd never questioned the rule before, but now that he said it, I couldn't shake the thought. What was out there? Before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "I'll go. Right now." The group erupted into cheers and dares, egging me on. I grabbed a flashlight from the garage and set off toward the fields, my heart pounding in my chest. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the landscape. The cornstalks swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching long and twisted across the ground. At first, it was almost peaceful. The air was warm and the sound of crickets filled the night. But as I ventured deeper into the field, the atmosphere shifted. The crickets fell silent, and the wind died down, leaving an oppressive stillness. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but all I could see were endless rows of corn. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite an animal, not quite human. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound came again, closer this time. I turned slowly, scanning the rows of corn, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I'd come this far, I couldn't turn back now. I moved forward, following the sound, my flashlight beam bouncing off the stalks. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer. It stood on all fours, its head lowered. But as it stepped into the beam of my flashlight, I realized it was something else entirely. Its fur was matted and patchy, like it had been rotting away, and its limbs were too long, too twisted, like they'd been broken and healed wrong. Its eyes glowed yellow in the darkness, and its mouth was filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It stared at me, tilting its head as if studying me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step toward me. I turned and ran, crashing through the cornstalks, the creature's growls echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the bonfire, my friends staring at me in shock. "What happened?" Tyler asked, his smirk gone. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. They laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I didn't sleep that night, and I never went into the fields after dark again. Years later, I finally got the truth out of my parents. They told me about the thing in the field, a skinwalker they called it, a creature that could take the form of animals but was something far more sinister. They said it had been there for generations, stalking the land and preying on anyone foolish enough to venture out at night. They'd never told me because they didn't want me to be afraid, but now I wish they had. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the dark. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting in the fields, watching from the shadows, and I wonder if it remembers me. Number 3. The Mimic. I was hiking alone in the mountains, enjoying the solitude and the crisp autumn air. The trail was familiar. I'd hiked it dozens of times before, but this time something felt off. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive silence. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the unease stayed with me, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. About an hour into the hike, I heard my name. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. I stopped, looking around, but there was no one there. The trees stretched high above me, their bare branches creaking in the wind. I called out, my voice echoing through the woods, but there was no response. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me and kept walking, though the nagging feeling didn't go away. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like my voice, but there was something wrong with it, something off. The way it echoed back at me sent chills down my spine like an unnatural distortion of sound. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. It was coming from deeper in the woods, off the trail, drawing me in. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. The rational part of me screamed to turn around, but something else, something darker, compelled me to investigate. It was like a force I couldn't fight, an invisible thread tugging me forward. I stepped off the trail, pushing through the thick underbrush, the voice growing louder with every step. It was calling my name over and over, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer just a whisper. It was mocking, teasing, as if the thing on the other end of the call knew me better than I knew myself. My breath hitched as I followed the sound, each step pulling me deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller and closer together, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew heavier, damp with the scent of moss and decay, and I began to feel the weight of something watching me. I told myself I was imagining things, but the voice kept calling my name, a twisted mimicry of my own voice, warping and stretching in ways that felt unnatural. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. The voice was now almost deafening, but it didn't seem to come from any one place. It was everywhere, echoing off the trees, reverberating in the very air around me. At the center of the clearing stood a figure. My heart stopped when I saw it, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. Same clothes, same face, even the same expression, but its eyes were hollow, black voids that swallowed the light. Its smile was too wide, far too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, like something was trying to break free from within. I couldn't move, frozen in place as the creature tilted its head, still smiling, its gaze never leaving me. It took a step toward me, its feet making no sound as they sank into the earth. My breath caught in my throat, a lump forming that I couldn't swallow down. The figure's smile widened even further, and then it spoke. "Come closer," it said, its voice a perfect imitation of mine, but there was no warmth in it, only a chilling, mocking tone. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, my feet tangling in the underbrush as my legs shook uncontrollably. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I crashed through the trees, tearing through the thick foliage, the sound of my own voice. My voice, laughing behind me, echoing in the stillness. I couldn't think. I couldn't stop. My body moved on pure instinct, driven by the primal fear flooding my veins. I didn't look back, but I could feel its presence growing closer, a dark shadow following me with every step. The laughter, the mocking, distorted laughter, grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. It was like the thing was everywhere, closing in on me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there. Just the empty trees and the darkness that stretched forever. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, my chest heaving, my legs trembling beneath me. The distant sound of rushing water, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots, all seemed like a distant memory. I was gasping for air, barely able to stand. I looked around, heart still pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of anything following me. The woods were silent once more, as if nothing had happened. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the wind is quiet, I hear my name whispered in the darkness. A soft, gentle call, just like the one from the woods. And I know it's still out there, waiting for me to make another mistake, to wander too far, to give it another chance. And it's always just one step behind. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please remember to like and subscribe for more.